Climate change, without doubt, is one of the largest threats to the long-term security of the human race. And in the shorter term, that means a threat to the security of the poor, the conflict-ridden, the under-resourced countries of our world. That's why we can't simply put it off while we settle the fine details of how far we believe it's anthropogenic and how far it isn't. One thing I think we can be sure of is that our existing practices in terms of carbon emissions and so forth are not making it any better. And if we know that, at least we know some of the things we ought to be doing. The timescale suggested at present for radical change threatening the stability, the viability almost of humanity on this planet becomes more alarming the more research appears. And that's why I think we just need to be aware of all the options that might be available to us. It is one of the most difficult things talking about climate change, that the sheer scale of it paralyzes people. People think it's much too big, there's nothing I can do, there's nothing even we can do, even with global coordination on this subject, which of course we haven't got at the moment. So I would say that one of the most important messages to get across is there are differences that can be made. There are differences in the level of pressure that people can put on their governments and that governments can put on each other. There are relatively small scale but quite important improvements that can be made in methods of food production and so forth in poorer countries. There are measures we can take about our own carbon emissions just as individuals and as families. And however uncertain the effects of this may be, the urgency is undeniable, and doing something is measurably better than doing nothing. There is a moral issue, not just a practical one. We need to behave better with our environment. It's crystal clear to me that we are talking about moral issues here. We're not simply talking about how to make ourselves feel more comfortable. We're talking about what we owe to our fellow human beings. Given the scale of the threat, given the fact that it weighs most heavily on those least able to protect themselves, my inclination to say is if this question of carbon emissions isn't a moral question, I don't quite know what is. When people talk about the need for a fundamental change in our nature, if we're to change our habits in regard to the environment, my inclination is to say, well, maybe we've got our nature wrong. Maybe what we ought to be thinking about is what the natural role of humanity is in the globe as opposed to what we've made of it. Because I think the natural thing for humanity is to be better in tune with our environment than otherwise, certainly better than we are at the moment. So I would say that any changes in behaviour and policy on this are about becoming more natural, more human, not feeding this myth that somehow the human race lives in a bubble protected from environmental crisis. So, yes, we need to think what kind of economy is more natural to us as human beings, rather than the supposition that endless exponential material growth is the only thing we have to look forward to. Now, on the small scale, on the local scale, there are changes we can make. There are changes we can make in the way that we approach agriculture, changes in the way we approach questions about the use and repletion of soil, questions about appropriate use of natural pesticides rather than chemical. All these things I've seen at work in developing countries on a small scale, and they're very impressive and they need more resourcing and more promotion. How we tackle the problems of the global economy overall and the extraordinary unreal system we seem to have got into, I find it very hard to imagine. I just think the question has to be asked and go on being asked. It's understandable in a way that many people are deeply wedded to ideals of national sovereignty, which make it hard for them to hand over responsibility for some areas to international bodies. And yet, what we are so bad at catching up with in our own age is the number of problems which cannot be solved by national sovereign bodies one by one or acting alone. And that's true not only of climate issues, it's true of environmental issues more generally, it's true of many health issues now. We do need better, more effective and robust international coordination, and international monitoring with some teeth on these matters. That's one of the greatest challenges we have, because a piecemeal approach is not quite going to cut it.